Why are we here? We have a massive housing crisis. That statement is true on the individual basis, where lack of housing is a crisis in individual people's lives. Saying it's a housing crisis isn't true in the fact that it is a result of policy and years of neglect and policy choices. So how do we actually call that a crisis? It's not a crisis, it's a choice. And yet, at the same time, we hear over and over once someone loses their housing as a result of these choices, as a result that now people widely recognize that there's a housing crisis. When the market fully fails someone, when they lose their housing, all of a sudden it's that person's individual fault, it's their individual responsibility, and it's because there's something fundamentally wrong with that person, and that person's pathologized and labeled often as mentally ill, as having a substance use disorder, or some other way pathologized. And then increasingly, but always, the response is control, and it's a carceral response. And the way that carceral response happens in people's lives is deeply interlocked with who that person is. It's deeply interlocked with race, gender, class, and disability. So we're here today to talk about that, to talk about the research that Dr. Ben-Moshe has done and what that means for our communities here in Vancouver. And I'm really excited to learn from these speakers. Feel pretty honored to be on this stage. So first I'm going to introduce Dr. Liat Ben-Moshe, who's an associate professor of law and justice at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Ben-Moshe at the Psych Out conference in Toronto in 2010. And Liat and I were part of a small group of disabled folks who tried to make critical interventions around disableism at the conference. And that was by far not the first time that Liat had worked to try and make those kinds of interventions, and certainly hasn't been, and unfortunately won't be, the last. And in my view, Liat has been a central figure in activism and a central scholar in pushing abolitionist theory and activism away from disableist complacency and getting movement figures to understand and embrace disability as central to abolitionism. She created the space to bring this conversation together as a co-editor of Disability Incarcerated, a 2014 anthology that is a book I really recommend that people check out. It talks about carceral systems that impact so many disabled people's lives. And then much of her own thinking comes together in Decarcerating Disability, which was published in 2020. And now, 4 years later, that book is already canonical in disability studies. It has fundamentally changed how many people think in disability studies, criminology, social work, and beyond. It's also really transformed how many activists approach their work, which in many ways I think is much more important. And so it's with my really sincere honor to welcome Liat to speak here today.
Thank you for coming here from Illinois.
You're welcome. It's on, okay. Hi everybody, thanks for having me. So first of all, I want to thank AJ, Dr. Withers. I knew AJ before we were doctors, both of us, all of us, for not just creating the space for this talk, applying for the grant to bring me here, and working to get me here, working to get a ramp, working to all the things, but also creating the intellectual and activist space in which this conversation could happen. Intellectual space, I'm sorry nobody did it, so I'll do it. AJ authored 3 amazing books. that you all should read. Fight to Win, Disability, Culture and Politics, was coming out May? Is it Culture and Politics?
Disability, Politics and Theory.
Politics and Theory. Two things on disability. That's coming up, the second edition in May. A Violent History of Benevolence, which is an amazing, amazing book. So that's a kind of the intellectual trajectory to this talk. But in terms of activism, I just want to thank AJ and a lot of you here in the room that came to meetings in the last 8 days. Of course, Ryan and Aero, and a lot of people in the audience that I got to meet, Amish and Bobby and Nicole and Laura and just a bunch of you. Thanks so much for teaching me about what's going on here in terms of housing and mental health and decriminalizing drugs and a bunch of other stuff that is both similar and different than what's going on in Chicago. And so for the next 30 minutes, 28 minutes, I'm going to kind of relay more general assessments, but also some of them are specific to the US. And then we will hear from Aero and Ryan and hopefully have a conversation around how that's connected to your lives here and what we can learn. Hi everybody, thanks for having me. So first of all, I want to thank AJ, Dr. Withers. I knew AJ before we were doctors, both of us, all of us, for not just creating the space for this talk, applying for the grant to bring me here and working to get me here, working to get a ramp, working to all the things, but also creating the intellectual and activist space in which this conversation could happen. Intellectual space, I'm sorry nobody did it, so I'll do it. AJ authored 3 amazing books that you all should read. Fight to Win, Disability, Culture and Politics, was coming out May? Is it Culture and Politics?
Disability, Politics and Theory.
Politics and Theory. 2 things on disability. That's coming up, the second edition in May. A Violent History of Benevolence, which is an amazing, amazing book. So that's a kind of the intellectual trajectory to this talk. But in terms of activism, I just want to thank AJ and a lot of you here in the room that came to meetings in the last 8 days. Of course, Ryan and Aero, and a lot of people in the audience that I got to meet, Amish and Bobby and Nicole and Laura and just a bunch of you. Thanks so much for teaching me about what's going on here in terms of housing and mental health and decriminalizing drugs and a bunch of other stuff that is both similar and different than what's going on in Chicago. And so for the next 30 minutes, 28 minutes, I'm going to kind of relay more general assessments, but also some of them are specific to the US. And then we will hear from Aero and Ryan and hopefully have a conversation around how that's connected to your lives here and what we can learn. In the next 25 minutes, I will talk about why prisons are not the new asylums. And so I'm going to talk about why disability and MAD analysis matter, and then why this idea that people ended up in prisons and jails because asylums and psychiatric facilities closed, why that's extremely problematic, and why that did not lead to the housing crisis that we have now. And so, first of all, a little bit about the kind of intersections that we're talking about today. I think it's very clear, and I hope to everybody in the room, that there's a lot of discussions, at least in the US, around mass incarceration. And since, in the last 5, 7, 8 years, also about prison abolition, defunding the police. But a lot of those conversations happen without any connection to disability or mental health. And that is incredibly problematic because, first of all, if any of you have ever been in a site of incarceration, particularly prisons and jails, but not only. There's a lot of us disabled people who are in there, but we are not necessarily understood as part of the conversation. And then secondly, there's incarceration happens in a variety of locations. So Dr. Withers mentioned the first book, the anthology, Disability Incarcerated, and what we try to do in that book and in general in the work that we do is to tell people, look, incarceration is not just something that happens in prisons and jails. It's something that happens in nursing homes, for example. It's something that happens in psychiatric facilities. It's something that happens in halfway homes. We talked about in the last 3 days about, well, you all told me, it's something that happens in supported housing. It's something that happens in a variety of things that are called home, right? Nursing homes, group homes, halfway homes, supported housing, but they're not actually homes. They're not our homes. And so and this is not to say that those things are a prison, because I am actually very cautious about saying that. They're not a prison, but they are all sites of incarceration. The reason why they're not a prison is because, the pathway to getting in there is not always through courts, it's not always through criminality. For example, if you go into a psych facility, there's no sentence. You don't know when you're getting out. So I'm not saying it's worse, I'm not saying it's better, it's just different, but they're both sites of incarceration. All of those things I said, nursing homes included, are all sites of incarceration. So it's really important to think about them in that way. And so if the network of incarceration is connected, if halfway homes and nursing homes and supported housing and psychiatric confinement and jails are connected, then that means that the way out of it is also connected. And most of most of my work is about kind of a way out, connecting particularly abolition, discussions about abolition or closure of prisons and psychiatric facilities and other facilities, how they're connected to each other. And so it's really important to say that for people who are not, kind of privy to what we mean when us in disability worlds, when we say disability and when we say madness, what we mean is disability as a way of life. We don't mean disability or madness as a deficit. We don't mean of it only as kind of a medical issue. We mean it as a part of our identity and a part of a culture. So not all disabled people are a part of disability culture. Not all disabled people are politicized as disabled, just like not all gay people are politicized as queer or gay. Not all women are feminists, not all, and so on and so on. But a lot of us are. And the reason is because not all of us, obviously grow up with disability and madness, around us in our family. And even if we do, it's not necessarily talked about as an identity and a culture. We don't know that we have a history. We don't know that we have a history of oppression, which is ableism. We don't know, or disableism, as you call it here. We don't know that, I'm laughing because all of AJ's book is about that. But we also don't know that we have a history of resistance to disableism. We don't know how we're connected to this history. And so this is really important because part of that history is the history of deinstitutionalization. So deinstitutionalization, the definition of it is that it's the transition of people with disabilities, particularly psychiatric disabilities or intellectual disabilities, from state institutions into, or hospitals, and into community living. The second part of the definition is that it's also the closure of these facilities. So deinstitutionalization, some people say, is how psychiatric institutions or residential institutions close down. But to me, it's not just a process of things that happened, but deinstitutionalization is a movement. And it's a logic, it's a way of thinking, and it's a way of pushing for change. And a lot of people fought for the institutionalization. They fought to close down these facilities. They fought for us to understand that people should not live in not their homes. People should not live segregated lives just because of their disabilities or psychiatric labels. But instead of learning from the lessons of the institutionalization, we often blame it for things like the rise in homelessness or the rise of incarceration. And people say, well, how come there's so many homeless or housing insecure people who are quote unquote crazy? Why are there so many people who are in jails and prisons who are crazy? So I'm here to answer those questions. So this is the only graph. I'm a social scientist, but I don't do graphs. This is somebody else's graph, and it's the only one here today. Okay, but in this graph, this is what happened in the US. So your mileage will vary in Canada, but in the US, there's a period of time in which the incarceration kind of epidemic or crisis soared. And it's a little bit after, you can see the kind of decline in psychiatric, particularly deinstitutionalization. So psychiatric hospitals closed, and incarceration soared. And so a lot of people take this graph and other things like it to say, hey, I know what caused the rise in incarceration. It was this, the psychiatric institutions closed. But in fact, we can complicate this narrative because for one thing, it didn't actually happen at the same time. There's like 15, sometimes 20-year difference between the when psychiatric facilities started to close and then closed down en masse, and when we see the rise in incarceration, and especially the rise in homelessness, that came even 10 years later. So in the US, we don't see kind of homelessness en masse until really the Reagan years, so the 80s. Deinstitutionalization in the US of psychiatric facilities was in the 60s, 70s. So, about a 15-year difference. And why do we blame homelessness in 2024 on deinstitutionalization that started in the 60s? Well, that already should give us like double alarming reasons. Secondly, in terms of demographics, if we were to see these kind of, let's say, buses that were, a lot of people in the last 2 days talked to me about Riverview facility in Vancouver that closed down. If we were to see, kind of buses moving from Riverview into prisons, the way that it would look in the US is that a lot of it would be white women. We would see a huge rise in white women in jails and prisons because those were the majority population that was incarcerated. But that's not what we saw. We saw a rise in mostly black men, black and brown, who are incarcerated. In Canada, it will be indigenous people. So these are not exactly the same populations. Now, this is not to say that people are not doubly medicalized and incarcerated. That's not what I'm saying. But this kind of theory of we closed facilities, they ended up in jail, is a little bit, demographically doesn't make sense. So the other thing then, and that's what is really important to me, is that this whole discourse around, well, people who are homeless are crazy, people who are homeless are mentally ill, people who are in jail and prisons are crazy, and so on. What that misses is that this category of the homeless mentally ill is not some neutral category. It's a category of people that we invented. Because mental illness is not something that resides in people. I want to emphasize this. Disability is not something in people. It's a label we put on people. It's a label we put on people based on difference and the meaning that we make of that difference. Now, that does not mean that we're all the same, and that does not mean that people don't have psychotic breaks, and that does not mean people are not in crisis, and that does not mean people don't need people to talk to, and that does not mean any of that. But we call something illness, that brings a whole slew of professionals medical professionals especially, into the lives of people. When we call something disability, we bring a whole slew of professionals into the lives of people with disabilities. And at that point, we also bring things like, we're taking away your children, you can get married, we are taking away rights to do ARBs, and so on and so on. This whole category of mental illness is a category that we socially put on people. So, over time, that category also changes. So what used to count, like in the US, for example, the psychiatric Bible is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and up until the 80s, for example, homosexuality, I'm saying that word because that's the word that was used, homosexuality was a mental illness. So you didn't need to be, gay and crazy or mad. It was just a category that was put, and then people fought for it to be taken out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And I'll talk about at the end about some of the problems with also taking it out. But the idea is that this whole category is a fluctuating category. It changes over time. What we socially identify as mad or disabled changes over time. And so the category of the homeless mentally ill also is a category that changes over time. And it's a socially defined category of people. It's not, let's count who's homeless mentally ill. Does that make sense? Because you can't count things that you yourself as a society defined. It's not like counting, shoes or something like that. It's again, a socially constructed category. So for people who are mad or identify themselves as mad, again, people who are politicized as mad, which is not everybody, a mad identity is a form of a difference. It's a form of diversity, part of like biodiversity, like a lot of other forms of diversity. It's a different aspect of being human. And the line between normal and not normal is not clear-cut. Another thing that's really important is that madness is normal for the people who embody it. So that, trying to change people by, treatment, especially forced treatment, by psychiatrization, by medication, is again, changing of people. And it's really important to also note that that changing of people comes from a history of colonialism. So this idea of there's only one way of being, and that one way of being is the white settler idea that's also connected to capitalism and productivity. And if you're outside of that thing, we are going to correct you. And I'm using that word specifically because the whole correction industry, which is criminal justice, but also medicalization, is about that. So we're going to correct you surgically, we're going to correct your speech, we're going to correct, we should speech pathologists, we're going to correct your actual language, we're going to correct how you do your hair, we're going to, all of the things. That comes from, again, a colonial kind of impetus. So it's really important to understand that madness is normal for people who embody it. And that also madness sometimes is generative, and it doesn't mean that it has like miracle properties, that's not what I'm saying, but it generates things, including resistance movements that close down institutions. Blaming the housing crisis on this is incredibly problematic. One is because being homeless itself is very disabling, so to kind of say, oh, homeless people are all crazy and all disabled, leads to a variety of consequences that I just pointed out to, like getting rid of people's rights, including rights to housing, but also institutionalizing them, taking away their kin, and so on. But also the fact is that when you do these kind of like surveys of counting the homeless mentally ill, the kind of things that people ask is, are people following you? Do you have trouble sleeping? Do you feel harm for your life? All of those are things that of course people are going to say yes to. But that whole counting makes no sense, right? That whole questionnaire is absolutely ludicrous from the lives of people who either are housing insecure or live on the streets, basically. So the budget for correction ballooned, and the budgets for welfare decreased. And by welfare, I also mean housing. And so it's not that deinstitutionalization led to the housing crisis, but they did happen at the same time because of the same cause, and that a lot of that money went into, in the US also militarization, but a lot of it corrections and policing. So why is then deinstitutionalization blamed? Well, it reduces a very complex process, like housing, the housing crisis, to a much kind of simpler thing, like, oh, you naive activists, closed institutions, bad, your fault, done, we don't have to fix housing or racism or settler colonialism or talk about anything, we are done here, thank you very much. And also what we're gonna do is that we're gonna bring back the asylum. So those are the consequences of having this discourse. This picture is from a film, so I only have like kind of 2 more points. This is from a film called The New Asylums. Literally, that's what the movie is called. It's a documentary. You can probably catch it. It's a PBS documentary. And this is a prison in Ohio. And what you see here is group therapy. So I'm not like making it up.
Group theory? That's group therapy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How would you describe this image?
People shouldn't be in cages.
People in cages, right? Like, yeah, I don't know how else to, for people who can see, it's people in cages, all sitting in a circle, in a cage, in a bigger cage, in a bigger cage. So the whole thing is in a prison, in a supermax. So supermax is like the highest level of prison in the US. So it's a cage in a cage in a cage. And this is considered to be like good because most prisons don't even have group therapy. So if we think about, kind of the mentally ill in prison, and then think about how that is blamed on getting rid of other forms of incarceration, like psychiatric hospitals, think about how ludicrous that sounds when you look at what actually goes on in prison. And the reason why there's so many crazy people in prison is because of prison. So there's a lot of words on the slide, but basically that's it. So,
If I was trained as a counselor, I couldn't, in my good conscience, participate in a program like that,
yeah.
no matter how much money you give me.
Yeah. Which is why there's a lot of shortage of people, good people who go in to prison to do this, and it's kind of how it should be, right? So it's an incredibly, when politicians like say these things, it sounds good, right? Like it sounds like, oh, this is why we have so many people who don't have houses. It's not about affordable housing. It's certainly not about settler colonialism or racism or anything like that. And it sounds like really good when they say that, oh, it's because Riverview closed and we have all these crazy people, and what do you want from me, right? But then when you see what actually goes on, like you just said, in facilities, then you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't hold any water. And so I think it's really important for us to build communities with each other so we can point to these things to each other to say, this not only doesn't make sense, it's incredibly dangerous for you to say that, right? You politicians and others, which is my last point. So my last point, my conclusion is, what we should watch for, which is the consequence of this narrative, and why we should be very critical of it when you hear it. When you hear somebody say, oh, so-and-so, it's the largest so-and-so jail where we live in Chicago, Cook County Jail is the largest mental health facility in the US. Prisons are the new asylums, or people are homeless because Riverview closed. Whenever you hear that, the consequence of that is what I call carceral saneism. Saneism, just so people would know, is the oppression that's faced by people due to the imperative to be sane, the imperative to be logical or not mentally ill or not psychiatrically disabled. And carceral saneism means the belief that people with disabilities or people who are mad need some kind of extra protection in ways that often boomerang against us disabled and mad people. So things like, oh, people with disabilities and are mad, they need their own jail. That's very common now in the US. People, also we need jails for people who have drug use. Very common also in the US now. Psychiatric units within jails, special psychiatric units for drug users, specialized professionals. So instead of the police, abolish the police, but let's call social workers. You know, all of these things, what they do is that they basically, again, boomerang against disabled people, but by other means. So instead of incarcerating people in one pathway, which is prison and jails, it's incarcerating people in other pathways, like psychiatric confinement, but also prisons and jails. So we're not getting rid of one over the other, we're just kind of adding more. And this is my last slide, and this is what's going on now in the US, which is we have, and I think it's coming here because everything great in the US always comes here. And so what is happening is that there's calls to reopen asylums. Because the institutionalization failed, there's a huge housing crisis, for example, in New York and in California, which are extremely expensive cities, very much like Vancouver, where people were completely bought out and evicted out of their own neighborhoods they've been at generationally, and of course, you know, Native people centurially, I don't know, since times immemorial, and are getting evicted out of those places. And so what the governor in California is doing now, just actually 2 days ago, Prop 1 passed, which is a huge bill that creates infrastructure to basically resurrect psychiatric forced confinement. And a similar thing is happening now in New York. So in these big cities that, again, having this like huge, I'm saying housing crisis, of course, in scare quotes, it's a manufactured crisis. But instead of talking about it as such, it's talked about as dangerous mentally ill. And what we need is not to address housing or capitalism or anything, but what we need to address is that we need to re-psychiatrize people. So this is literally right now, like this week, this month, this year in the US. I think it's coming your way, so I'm giving you a bit of a head start in terms of organizing, I hope. All right, thank you for listening, and I hope stay in touch.
AJ, I know I've kind of spoken up a little bit more out of turn today than usual, but I would like to gently remind people that everything that, I forgot your name, sorry, Dr.
Ben-Moshe.
Oh, I can't hear
Ben-Moshe.
yeah. This is the logical outcome of living in a late-stage capitalist settler colonial society. The homeless people, the people dying right down the street right now, these aren't bugs of the system, they're features.
Yeah, thanks for, and we'll have a chance for questions and conversation in a bit, but absolutely. Capitalism and colonialism are the reason that we are here, and without them going away, things can't get better to the point that they need to be in people's lives. So thank you. So I'm excited to introduce the next speaker, who's Aero Marion. And Aero is someone with an infectious smile who often brings joy into any room that they enter, and also is incredibly knowledgeable and not afraid to tell you what's what. And I'm really thankful that they have taken the time and had the patience to help teach me about the downtown east side, about carceral housing, and organizing in both of these contexts. Aero is on the board of the 25-year-old Vancouver area network of drug users, VANDU, which is a feat for any radical group to stick around for that long. Works with our streets, with Our Homes Can't Wait, with the Carceral Housing Assemblage Research Project, and among many other things. So, Aero, thank you.
Hi everyone. My name, like she said, is Aero, but my real birth name is Aero Marion. For me personally, when I came to downtown Eastside Vancouver, I was on drugs, and I came down here to die. And in a way, I did die, but out of those ashes came out Aero.
Yes.
And I come from Winnipeg, Manitoba. I was born there, but I was raised out here in BC. I'm Cree, Ojibwe, Soto, French and Scottish, and I was living on the streets since 2019, because I stole off of my mom. My Arian stole off of my mom. And she's like, that's it. No more. Get out. Never come back. And I was like, okay. I took whatever money I stole from her. I came down here to try to die, and I did. But out of that came out Aero, which is very humble, caring, would literally give my shirt off of my back for the next person, because he's caring, he's selfless, and he would do anything and everything to keep humanity good, like keep them safe and keep them warm. And being homeless sucks, because I was homeless. I was homeless for 2 years. I was sleeping out on the streets. I was sleeping in alleyways, just to keep out of the rain, keep out of the chaos that was happening on Hastings, Tent City, and one day I was out collecting cans so I could get my next hit, and I was hearing this one person was over at Pigeon Park. That they were speaking for street sweeps, and I stood there and I listened to them speak, and I was like, damn, that's so sorry for my language. Damn, that's so fucking amazing. And I was just like, I wanna do this. So after they were done, I went to the head organizer, and I was like, I want to sign up, because I stand behind of what you're trying to say about the community, about the Hastings Tent City. just everything. And it brought me up and it made me feel like I was Superman. And all they told me was come by Vancouver and sign up to be a member and get more involved. The next day, I went there and I signed up and I went to the head organizer and I was like, what do you want me to do? Just go to meetings, and then if there's jobs, I will come and get you. I went to a couple of meetings, and then the head organizer, he's like, oh, I got a job for you. And I was like, okay. So he told me go to Columbia and Hastings at 10 o'clock. And so I didn't have a time. And so this is when Auschwitz happened. And we had 5 different programs. And there was drumming with Clint, singing with Bob, brooming. We took five people, and we sent them out, and we gave them $20 to bring the brooms back for an hour, and it was so liberating because we made a community. We got people to come together to come together as strong and to be a community, and the Vancouver Police Departments and the City of Vancouver did not like that. So they 3 months before our contract was up, they defund us. They took away our money, all because we were organizing, and they were scared. And sorry, I have a little cheat sheet here. Yeah, I got involved in on August 9th, the police riot. There was they told us that they were going to be a soft encampment. So me and my colleagues, we went out and to see what was going on, and the city workers and Vancouver police, they were out there with totes, garbage totes, and they put over the garbage label and said storage, and that's what they put all their stuff into garbage cans, and they like, who knows what they did with them. And so there was something happening over at Carnegie, and about 12 to 15 cruisers came roaring out, and a whole bunch of cops were there, and I saw my colleague going down. I ran and tried to get my colleague out of there, but I got intercepted. I got thrown on the ground, I got beaten on, I got punched, kneed, and kicked, and I had my hair up into a ponytail, and I got 10 minutes. They took my ponytail, they lifted my head up, and they smashed my head on the ground, and then they kept beating on me. And I tried to not fight them, but they still they were beating on me, and I got charged. I got arrested. I got put into holding for half a day. Then I got released, and then I went to court, and I got charged with with assaulting a police officer and assault with bodily harm, meaning I bit the officer. But the crazy thing is, I have no teeth. So how could I bite the police officer? And yeah, so my house, after that happened, I stayed over at a friend's place, and then I got housing. Finally, after what happened and what I was doing for the community, I finally got housing. It wasn't proper housing, it was a social housing, which was, it was degrading. They didn't care about us. It was infested with bed bugs, cockroaches, mice. Thankfully, I never had bed bugs. I only had roaches and mice. But they have cameras. They said we had curfew. We had to be in by 11 o'clock. Our guest policy was only one person a day, and that person can only stay up until 11 o'clock. Because this is when Atira was running. That was owning the building, and then they got bought out by community builders, which is far more worse than Atira. And I just want to say, like, would you like to live in one of those? Would you like your children to live in a fucked up building like that? Because I would not. I would never let my child live in that situation like that I am living in right now. Thank you very much, and thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you so much, Aero. And I just want to correct something that I said earlier, because I'm pretty new to Vancouver. I come from Ontario, where words mean different things. So I said social housing means a bit of a different thing there. So non-market public housing is something that we need. The way that social housing works here is different and quite problematic. So our final speaker is Ryan Sudds, and he's a dad, an activist, filmmaker, and an organizer with Stop the Sweeps. And Ryan's here because he knows a lot about these issues through his tireless organizing and his support labor. And I respect him as an organizer because I see his coming to the work with humility and working to build community, to build care through relationships. And so I want folks to please welcome Ryan.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And I'm always like, I've heard this story, I've heard everyone talk many times, and I'm just always touched. Yeah, listening to Liat, it's interesting because I find it all very validating from like a theoretical standpoint, from what I see as an organizer on the ground with Stop the Sweeps. So it's nice. I feel, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but more sane, but that's not actually, I think, the right way to say it in this situation. Maybe more mad, I don't know. But so yeah, so I'm an organizer with Stop the Sweeps. I'm gonna describe a little bit what a street sweep is, what Stop the Sweeps is, and then try to place street sweeps kind of in the context that we're talking about here. So a street sweep, as I kind of see it, is the displacement of unhoused people from public spaces, be they streets or parks. Usually it's under the auspices of some sort of bylaw, memorandum of understanding, fire order, or something along those lines. And it manifests as a group of city workers, park rangers, or police, almost always men. It's a vast majority of men, so it's a very masculine thing. Patrolling neighborhoods, streets, parks, looking for unhoused people to enforce upon. Sometimes it's patrolling, and sometimes it's literally driving around streets hunting people down. The sweeps crew, they're going around, they hunt people down, and I really feel like they do really hunt folks down, and they'll use a number of tactics to displace people from those places. Sorry, I'm just gonna catch my breath after that. But the way they end up looking, thanks, Aero. The way they end up looking is a sweep will kind of work from something very like soft, as Aero mentioned this word soft encampment, where it's this group of large men and police with guns going around to an unhoused person with a reminder of like, hey, you can't be here, you gotta move, and then they move on. But it always escalates. It always gets worse and worse and worse, to the point where unhoused people will literally have cages built around them to contain them or control them. So it goes from something that like is hard maybe to see as carceral to something that becomes explicitly carceral, and is something that we're going to see in the coming week here in the city in Vancouver at Crab Park, where the city's about to erect cages around unhoused people, and we see this quite often. Our work is Stop the Sweeps is finding ways alongside unhoused residents to resist these sweeps and to slow them down. And so a lot of our work is what we would call like a counter street sweep or counter patrols, where if we know that street sweeps crews are going through a certain neighborhood, we might follow those crews and get to know the unhoused people who are being targeted by those sweeps, work alongside them to create space for people to take control of what's happening during those sweeps, because what so often happens during a sweep is people are robbed of their autonomy because they're trying to move people so quickly. So it's, you need to pack up right now, get your stuff, you need to go on, you can't be here. And sometimes we found out often that people, if they just said, no, I'm gonna stay, they would be allowed to stay. So the sweep moved so fast that would rob people of the ability to say no. So part of our work became trying to, alongside the resident, always alongside the resident, taking direction from that person, trying to create space with it. But as part of this work, we get, unfortunately, we get really close to the city workers, and we talk to them, and we find out a little bit about how they think. And sometimes we get to talk to some of the higher up folks, and I want to bring this up because it's like the manager of homelessness services in the city of Vancouver revealed to me that they viewed the closing down of Riverview, as was mentioned earlier, as a massive overswing. And now we're in this place where there are all kinds of folks out on the street because we don't have places to put people. We don't have harsh enough measures to control people. And in that situation, we need street sweeps, because street sweeps are a form of involuntary care. It's something where it's okay to override that person's autonomy because, as has been mentioned, homelessness and being unhoused is a personal failing. It is a sickness. And so what's scary to me is that it manifests in city policy already. I was watching a video from BC Housing about a shelter, and in the video it uses language about the shelter as it's a place for an unhoused person to go to recover from experiencing homelessness. As if shelters are a recovery space, as if people are addicted to homelessness and they've got to go to a space to recover from it. So they really, really push this idea that it is a personal failing, and because it's a personal failing, that allows street sweeps to rob people of their autonomy. Just last week, the Minister of Finance admitted in an interview that they are, within government, having conversations about increasing the use of involuntary care against unhoused people. And one of the things that I found in the language that folks use, they would talk to me about why they would go back to unhoused people over and over again after they had said no. And they admitted to me that part of why street sweep, part of the mentality and the philosophy of the street sweep is to go back to someone over and over and over again to break them, to cause them to crack. And this word that really stuck in my mind is that when someone cracks and takes shelter, that they've got a conversion. And that was the word that they used. They converted somebody. They converted somebody from being street entrenched into somebody who is now what they wanted that person to be. Because what they don't want that person to be is somebody on the street, because they view, the city views, the state views, the province views, that the safest place for someone to be is a shelter, or whatever the case is, regardless of how that individual feels, because that individual no longer has the capacity to decide what's safe for themselves. The person who knows that is the manager of homelessness services. How much time do I have left? Perfect. Is the manager of homeless services, or David Eby, or whomever, or whatever the case is. And it rules out so much of people's own personal experiences. The first time that this was made clear to me, where I saw it, was at Crab Park for probably the third fight to have a Crab Park during a lot of decampments. And there was an Indigenous couple who were under a lot of pressure to go into a shelter, and they were refusing to go into the shelter because they would be split up. Men were going to be over here and women were going to be over there, and they said, this reminds me of a residential school. I don't want to go to that shelter. That's not acceptable for me. That's not dignified for me. That's not acceptable housing. But in the government's eyes, despite commitments to UNDRIP and Truth and Reconciliation, that was an acceptable process. That was a humane thing to do. And so, part of what I find so difficult with this is how the state overrides its own kind of neoliberal language and its commitments to things when it comes to on the ground, and how they ignore their commitments. It really reveals how bad faith they act in these situations. I also, when I think about sweeps and how they operate, they themselves are carceral. They serve to move in the public, move down the streets, and create it's another site of incarceration. So the sweep is actually able to move incarceration person to person, block to block, space to space. And they use this language, we've seen it in some of the city documents where they use sweeps to reset behavior, which is similar to this line I'm talking about around conversion. But I think part of how it wants to reset behavior is sweeps exist to make the street, to make the park, to make the public space more inhospitable than it may already be. Because the housing, the shelter that people don't want to go into for a variety of very, very valid reasons, if the street or the park is hospitable, it's less and less likely they're going to take that carceral housing. They're going to go into that institution. But if the street becomes more carceral, or the park becomes more carceral, or that space becomes more carceral and harsher, it's more likely that they're going to go into that space. And the more likely someone is to take this crappy housing offer, the more they get away with making crappy housing. And so by making the streets as inhospitable as possible, they don't have to make hospitable, dignified housing. And so the sweeps really worked, I think, to allow them to create carceral, inhospitable housing and push people into that. And get their conversion, so they can track that and report at the conference of street sweepers about how many conversions they got into their system, or whatever it is these people do to spread their horrible ideas around. It makes me very angry. I guess just wrapping up, when I think about solutions, the solution is what Aero talked about. Like, in talking to Liat on Tuesday, it really made me realize that when sweeps stopped on Hastings Street, which is what led to the Hastings tent city, that was the abolition of street sweeps. And that was a massive victory for a small period of time. And what people tried to do in the vacuum of the deinstitutionalization of that street, people tried to build community. And they got money from the government to do that, but through that process, the government tried to co-opt that good energy and turn the community against itself and wanted the community to displace itself. So it's always, I find, it's always wrestling to turn our good energy back into the institution and back into something carceral. But the solution is, like, as someone who, as part of Stop the Sweeps, I believe the answer is stopping the sweeps. And even if we build all of the housing in the world, but you're still forcing people into that housing at gunpoint, there is no housing justice. It's not just about building housing, and it's not just about building better housing, it's about consent to go into that housing and having people's autonomy respected. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And we're going to get to questions in a minute. I just want to put some of what Liat was saying into the Canadian context. So with respect to Riverview, so people know it was started in 1913 as Essendale Asylum or Provincial Psychiatric Facility. Many forced sterilizations took place there under the BC Sexual Sterilization Act, eugenic legislation, and also forced labor took there. Colony Farm was forced psychiatric labor, now a park that lots of people like. Deinstitutionalization started in the 1950s. Between 1968 and 1978, the population was halved. So by 1992, there were 358 beds in Riverview. And then it actually started to go up a bit. And then it was closed in 2012. In Alberta, in 1965, there were 4.1 beds per 1,000 people, and then that went down by 1980 to 0.7 psychiatric beds per 1,000 people. And I came across this quote that was from 1990 by some person named Simmons that says, "Deinstitutionalization was an incredible thing. All you had to do was to load them with neuroleptic drugs and send them into the community. So we took tens of thousands of patients and threw them out of the hospital without any support. We said there was going to be follow-up, but the fact of the matter is that nobody really understood, so the bureaucrats were delighted to get them out of hospitals, and only later did we say, hey, this is crazy, what about housing?" And then the Calgary Federation of Homelessness, which is or Homelessness Foundation is a really terrible organization, uses this to say, according to Calgary's point in time count, the growth of homelessness for single adults has stabilized in 2014. So they use this quote to say this caused homelessness, but then by 2014, homelessness stabilized. At that point, around that time of the quote, homelessness in Calgary was 500 people. And then by 1996, it's 1,000 people. So deinstitutionalization happened way, way before. This person blames it on deinstitutionalization in 90, and then we see homelessness dramatically increase through the 90s. So by 2004, it's 2,400. And by the time that the Homelessness Federation says that it's stabilized, it's at 3,200. And then it starts to go down a little bit. But they're blaming deinstitutionalization as the cause of homelessness. So this is how this discourse works, and it's really simplistic discourse, but it's not an American exceptionalism. It's very much the numbers add up in Canada as well. So I just want to begin with asking the speakers a question about if you can speak to the issue of gender. And gender safety is often really mobilized in reflection to sweeps to justify carceral tactics and systems. Sex work gets conflated with human trafficking a lot of the time in relation to encampments. And there's a lot of attention paid to encampment safety for women, but we know that there's a lot of violence in SROs against women, and that's neglected in the same safety discourse and mobilization of safety for women and gender minorities. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on safety, gender, in relation to carceral homelessness and housing.
I'm good. Hello? Okay. Well, personally for me, I find that it's degrading for the genders and like the sex workers, and it's just like they're human beings just like us. Like we all bleed the same. So why are we putting like us into different categories when I'm brown, Ryan's white, so some of you might be Chinese, but when we cut ourselves, what do we bleed? Red. That's what should matter. None of this fucking genderizing. I'm sorry. I'm too mad. I'm too mad to answer this one.
In the lead up to the Hastings tent city destruction decampment in April 5th, gender-based violence was one of the very public and prominent reasons for that. And in talking to city workers, they would often describe that we have to get rid of the tent city in order to get gender-based violence off of the street. And so it was rooting that, to me, the idea was that the cause of gender-based violence is the existence of tent cities. Just like the cause of homelessness is a failing of that individual person. But, as street sweeps are a form of incarceration, so too are they a surveillance system, as incarceration is. And so because people have so little privacy when you're living in a tent city, yes, gender-based violence is visible. And it's more visible than it is in my apartment building. And it's more visible than it is in the halls of the legislature in Victoria. And it's more visible than it is in Hollywood. But there it gets kind of, it did become visible, but it's also like, I guess what I'm just trying to say is that we see it. Homelessness is dangerous, and we see those dangers more visibly because you're surveilling them and because people have no privacy. But it's in really bad faith to say that if you get rid of a tent city, there's not going to be gender-based violence, because I'm pretty sure there are a lot less tents on Hastings Street right now. But I don't believe that there's been a decrease in gender-based violence in our society or structurally because a whole bunch of people have lost their tents and homes. And the last thing I'll just say is that I have never been more threatened as a man by men than being around street sweepers. The masculine energy of that crew is terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying, and there's a reason for that. And I'll leave it there.
So one of the things that, especially in terms of abolition, that's often talked about, just like Ryan was saying, is that feminist abolitionists see the prisons as violence against women, right? So the way, and I think this is how we need to see street sweeps, this is how we can see they are in themselves violence against women and gender non-conforming people. So the way, for example, that we normalize things like cavity searches. You know, so like when I teach in prison, in one of the rooms that I teach in order for the people to go into that room, they have to be cavity searched. By people, I mean the people who are incarcerated in that facility. And so in order for them to access education, they have to get sexually assaulted by guards. And that is sanctioned by the state. And we don't call it sexual assault, but what else is it? Right? So, you know, I think we kind of normalize it when it's, you know, when it comes from the state, but this is sexual assault. And then they weaponize the sexual assault that does happen. So for example, in psych facilities, in nursing homes and in prisons, of course people talk about, you know, rape and sexual assault, and often they mean it to allude like other inmates, right? Like I'm sure you've seen on TV shows and, you know, all of that, right? And I'm not saying that there's not some pervasiveness to that, especially from the reasons that Ryan pointed out, like that it's just visible. But there's a lot of assault by, you know, guards and agents of the state, and that is not gets, you know, to be talked about. And so that is, you know, I think a really important framework to emphasize. I mean, the violence comes from outside, right?
Thank you. So we're gonna have questions. I'm gonna take 3 questions and then we'll bring them to the panel. So I think someone's gonna come around with the microphone. So I see Herb first.
To add on, well, I wanna say, yeah, everybody can hear. I wanna say one thing. Just wanna say Ryan's not a pretender. He actually got arrested at the park. He's not just academic.
He's a tough old bird.
But to add on to what you two were saying, I can't remember your names, sorry, I'm terrible with names. On the one hand, I want to say this is the logical end of settler colonialism. These aren't bugs of the system, these are features. We need to remember that. We need to strategize against that. And to also add on to the sexual assault angle that you were just talking about a moment ago, that's just recriminalizing us. This is what they always do. They criminalize us, they criminalize us, they criminalize us. And that's not to say it doesn't happen, it does happen. But it's not most people on the hazing strip. It's just, you know, one person can do a lot of damage. And also the cops do it. So that's what the state is. That's what the settler colonial state is. They have a monopoly on violence. When we organize and we strategize, we're disarmed with their phones, and they have their guns. And that's a very serious thing that we gotta deal with.
Thanks, Herb. I saw Dave with his hand up back there.
Hello, compadres.
Hello.
So, I thought it was very interesting when I was made to realize that the most meaningful and most of the interaction that the street folk have is involving the engineering department of the city. Like, how can that be meaningful? How can that have any kind of you know, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Like, does that speak of a city caring or anything like that. Like they're trying to say that they're correcting people and adjusting them to become better citizens. Well, you know, I don't think the people that are cleaning the streets are the people that you should be talking to. And that, you know what I mean? So I'm just putting it to you guys that, like, what are we going to do about that?
Thanks, David. There's one more right there.
Hi, thank you for a great talk today. I'm wondering, as I guess just a concerned resident, that we see year over year this problem just grow and get worse, and the misinformation around it spread further and further. Also, as someone that's been trying to learn more about the issue, I'm really surprised at how hard it is to find information like this out there. So I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for what can be done to try and support solving this issue, and recommendations for educational resources around this.
Thank you. So,
I was reading of the Stop the Street Part 1.
Hi, you can. Hello. Okay, sorry. You can come to 380 East Hastings, called Vandu. You can come anytime between 8 and 6 and talk to one of the staff members there, and they will help you with your questions.
I do want to answer any other questions.
Oh, and for what Dave said about I forgot what he said, but what came to my mind was genocide, and I can't remember what Herb said. Sorry, Herb.
What I said is it's a feature of this system that we live under, not a bug.
Oh, it's what's that word that David likes to use? It's a G word. Gentrified? No.
Gentrification?
Gentrification.
Oh, just to holler out one quick thing, sorry, Ryan. Just to holler out one quick thing. Just to holler out one quick thing. The first homeless people here in so-called Canada were the so-called white people. Who gave them homes? Who gave them homes? Oh, and one thing before I give up the mic, who keeps us safe?
We do!
Who keeps us safe? Who keeps us safe? I can't hear you.
We keep us
We
safe.
keep us safe. Come on.
That's right.
I got a mic and... Or actually, I don't even need the mic. Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe!
There we go. Thank you.
Woo!
Yeah, and so like you're right, like I see the like street sweeps are an extension of the initial colonial displacement, and like to your point, that is the fixture, and it's not coincidence that there are more Indigenous people being displaced by street sweeps. It's also fascinating to me, like everybody's resisting street sweeps in their own way, and it's not a race and it's not a hierarchy to see who's doing the best. But I have seen some of the most aggressive and strongest resistance of street sweeps coming from Indigenous people, and in return, I have seen them be met with the most violence. And that is a fixture of the system, absolutely. And so and like part of this, to Dave's point then, is, so street sweeps are part of the engineering department, specifically solid waste management. So the primary contact between the city and unhoused people is solid waste management, AKA the garbage department. And it's shame. And so, like, how do you commit genocide? You convince people that other people are lesser than those, and it's a fixture of the system because it's embedded in the name of the department that actually deals with unhoused people.
You're treating them like garbage.
It's in the name. It's in the name. They don't see it. I don't know. And so just in terms of education, like, What we're against is an entire system that wants us to not pay attention to what's happening here. Ideologically, from just like, there's so much pro-displacement sort of like, and pro-incarceration like hum in so much media that we watch. I'll say there is a Stop the Sweeps documentary that I and many people in this room had a hand in making. We are going to put that online soon, so there'll be a space for people to go see that. There is a Stop the Sweeps Twitter account, Stop Sweeps Ban, that does kind of post around what's happening right now with displacement. I'm sure there are other resources, but I would say those are two spaces. And then just in terms of like what to do, like as Herb said, like we have phones and they have guns. Is like, I'm not saying everybody go around and start chasing street sweeps crews with phones, but it is important when displacement is happening in our communities not to ignore it and not to turn around and not to pretend it's not happening. It is important to look at it, to see it and know what it's like. And when someone asks you why you're late for going over to a party, you can say, oh, I was stopped because someone was being displaced. And I made the decision to stay there and watch it. So one thing, there's education, but there's also, what's that, Dave?
And took some video.
And took some video, maybe, but like, be careful. Don't get arrested, be careful.
The reason why they are, the people are going after indigenous people, I really hate that word, is because they're scared of what we might do if we come together as one.
In terms of, in terms of kind of solutions, I think one thing to be careful of is any solution that offers a solution. Anybody that comes to you and says, I have a solution, immediately distrust. Because these are like really complex issues, right? So if somebody says, I know how to solve the housing crisis, it's like 100% going to be some other carceral, mechanism. And so, this is why it's so hard to talk about these things, because they are complex and people don't want to have complex conversations. And so, when people say, so what do you offer, like instead of psych facilities and instead of prisons and instead of, those are like kind of the wrong questions in my opinion. I mean, the question is like, what do we do with harm? That would be a good question, and we should talk about that. But it's like a different question already, right? Like, what do we do with the homeless is absolutely not the question. There is no the homeless, there is us and kind of what's happening, and there is asking people what they need. That is a different question than what to do with, as if, it's some kind of a different kind of species. And so I think it's really important to break the narrative. Like, I think that is part of, honestly, like that is part of the solution, is to, like Ryan is saying, also not normalize it. So when somebody says, you're just like going down the street and you see, Airbnb, it's like really important to stop, to like talk about it, to make sure that we're not like normalizing this. And I think that's like so crucial. And I think this is the same with the issue of housing. I think it's the same with Palestine. I think it's the same with, it's like we gotta just keep talking about it, not normalize it. This is not normal. This is not how it should be. Money going to war instead of like people's security, and instead of people's needs being met, to policing, to all of those things are things that we should disrupt. This is not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, and if people come, like, if someone has a solution, distrust them, but also there are some basic things that we know need to be put in place. And if someone comes to you and says we need another study, that's also something to distrust. Yes. And the university is a site of violence and a way that is used to perpetuate lack of change. So we know that we need money, we know that we need less cops, we know that we need housing, and researchers are there often to keep that from happening. This space is part of a gentrification project, right? So like we can use this space together to come together to learn, to use the resources, but also if that's all we do here, we're really not doing enough. We have to go out and we have to work, we have to do things. So we are really pretty much out of time. I saw some other hands, but we have a tight get the heck out of this room time. But we can chat in the hall. I want to give our speakers like one last word.
Hi, Aero again. Hi y'all. It was a pleasure talking with you guys and explaining my story and everybody else's story. But there's one thing that I like to say. Some of you may know it, some of you may not know it. Whose streets?
Our streets!
Yeah, I also just want to say thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel and being here. It's like the process of preparing for this and hearing our talk and reading some of Liat's work and hearing it here has really got me thinking around shifting from stopping the sweeps to abolish the sweeps, putting in more of an abolitionist framework in that sense. And it's even helping me reclaim some of the abolition work, seeing, I guess, as I was talking about a spectrum of incarceration. I feel some of our work has also been on the spectrum of abolition, and that makes me feel good. And I'm happy to come to that realization with all of you here today. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me. The last thing I would say is just kind of a cautionary thing of what the kind of state is investing in, what we need to divest from is kind of pitting each other against each other. So this separating ourselves from housing, from drug use, from mental health, from disability, from, that has had a very long history of happening. So not just the siloing, but literally pitting campaigns, populations, and organizing against each other in the ways I was talking about today. To say the reason why there's so many people in prison is because of deinstitutionalization, for example. And another way to kind of look at it, just in closing, is through gender and sexuality. So sexuality has been used very much, let's say, for example, in prisons, also in psych hospitals, in nursing homes, to show how, basically, there is no sanctioned sexuality in these spaces. I mean, I don't have to tell you, people who have ever been in these spaces, there's no access to actual sanctioned sexuality, especially same-sex sexuality, and then the assumption is that everything is rape and sexual assault, and then there's a whole infrastructure of criminality and illegality that's built around it. So it's really important to not kind of reproduce that in our analysis, it's just one example, and in our organizing, and instead to kind of to look at all the ways in which people are made to be garbage. Literally, that was such a powerful, example, and how we can fight it coalitionally instead of distancing ourselves from particular population that's being done to. So I think really, if you get one thing from this kind of tale, is that we need more coalitional work around these issues, and that's the only way out. And thank you so much, Ada and Lady, for.
Once again, thanks to all three speakers for coming. This was really wonderful. I learned a lot. Thanks especially to Liat for traveling so far. Thanks to all of you for taking time out of your nights. Please leave the room promptly. love to chat with you in the hall. Have a great night.